Hey everyone, Tactics here, where in this video I'll be walking you guys through a Dawn of the Infinite's hard mode run that we did on week 1 of Season 4, going over some of the new mechanics that are added in on top of the Mythic Zero mechanics on some of these bosses, as well as how I just generally recommend you handle them. For those wondering why you would want to do the Mega Dungeon in Season 4 on hard mode, the answer is hero track gear. So when hard mode is actually activated, which is done by talking to Nozdormu at the start of the dungeon, it scales up all the bosses and trash in the dungeon, adds a few new abilities to some of the bosses as well, and to compensate for that, every single boss in the dungeon now drops, I believe, 509 eye level gear, all on the hero track. So this is especially nice if you're hunting for specific trinkets like the cheat death trinket from here, or a certain special effect gear like the healer gear with spirit on it, or the time strike weapons, things like that, as you're now able to get them at a pretty competitive eye level. On top of that, I've heard, unable to 100% confirm, but I will let you guys know, that if you do a deathless hard mode, it actually increases the last boss item drop eye level, only the last boss, up onto the myth track instead of the heroic track. So potentially, if you're looking to get like the mirror trinket off the last boss, you're able to actually get it at the highest potential eye level in Season 4. Just keep in mind, the loot lockout on hard mode is tied to the Mythic Zero Dawn of the Infinite, so you can't do both of them. You can only do one of them. And also, it is weekly, since it is tied to the Mythic Zero, and those are now weekly loot lockouts. You only have one shot per week. In terms of difficulty, I actually think this was decently hard for week 1 of the patch. The group of us were mostly in the low to mid 490s, so we weren't super geared or anything like that. And it took us about an hour, a little bit over an hour, to do a full clear of the entire thing, with a few wipes thrown in there as well. Comparing it to keystone scaling, I'd put it around like a +9 to +10 if you're looking at like boss health and damage output, with it being on the higher end of that. But something to keep in mind is that you can actually change specs whenever you want inside these dungeons, because they're not considered Mythic Plus dungeons, right? They're just Mythic Zero. And that can be very, very helpful for bosses, especially where you can go into like a full single target or more defensive or whatever tailored to that boss specifically, as opposed to just doing them in your Mythic Plus build. So underrated thing, make sure you are switching your specs as needed, because some of these bosses are tough, especially like the last boss on Deios. I'll talk about that on Deios specifically, because we're going to go through the bosses now in order, and we're starting here on Chronikar. So generally just walking you through his basic abilities. He's going to put pools on every single player. This is a little cleave around everyone, and you want to just make sure you're using your space correctly, because these take a little bit before they expire. As you can see here, using the space we have, getting out of the puddles as soon as you can. He will also do a leap attack. This is on 3 players now on hard mode, from 2 on the regular mythic. So it's going to target one player, jump on their original location, then go to the next player, jump to their original location, and then just to a third player. You can see here we're jumping in. You need to make sure you have at least one person at every single one of these soaks that spawns, otherwise people are going to die. And the other thing is the little fragments that shoot out are very dangerous on hard mode. Like I think they're probably just going to one-shot you if you get hit by them at the eye level we were at. So again, make sure you are dodging those as well. The only other thing to keep in mind on this boss is the Chrono Shear attack, and this is really, really amped up on hard mode compared to Mythic Zero. It puts a massive healing absorb on your tank, as well as a 200%, I believe, damage amp on them. So you want to make sure you're overlapping good CDs. Here I'm in meta, and I get an external, I believe, as well. And this is also the first time I took it, so I wasn't sure how dangerous it was going to be. So I use meta. I use Feldev to get some self-healing. So if you have any self-healing, like Frenzied Regen, saving up some of the free Word of Glory procs, whatever it is your spec can do, obviously saving up runic power to Death Strike, that kind of thing. You want to save some self-healing for when this happens, and also healers, be aware, you really want to pump healing into your tank when this happens to get rid of that healing absorb as quickly as possible, which then needs to be magic dispelled. But also tanks, you want to make sure you have some defensives running as well, because you are going to be taking probably a few autos from the boss with the large damage amp before the healing absorb is gone. You can see how hard they're hitting, right? I get the external, we heal through it, and then we're gone. So you want to make sure, basically for tanks, the main damage source you're going to be stacking are those Chrono Shears, which you can see happen around 50 seconds, I believe. They're about 50 seconds apart, those Chrono Shears. So time your defensives accordingly, and make sure you have a decent chunk, and just stack defensives for each Chrono Shear, as many as you possibly can. Otherwise, you're just going to keep filling up the room with the pools, and just keep soaking those leaps whenever you can. Again, not making sure to let any of these little soaks individually actually detonate. That is Chronikar. Again, pretty straightforward, not too many changes. Let's go to Manifested Timeways here, a little forward. Here he is. And so the big thing for this is there's actually an entirely new mechanic on this boss fight, and that is Unwind Time. So, okay, close all these windows, thank you. Basically, this is a frontal attack on the tank. Here it is. Boom. Frontal attack on the tank. This actually hits twice. So the first hit and the second hit are separate, but the time between the two hits is actually dependent on the zone you are in. So for those that don't know, if you're in this dark zone, it's called the decay zone. You take ticking damage every 3 seconds, and you also have a 20% DR. So this is the zone you want to be in for most of the fight. Then there's a speed zone here, which are the lighter zones, and this ticks every second, so it ticks 3 times as fast, and it also gives you a 30% move speed. You want to avoid this whenever possible, though there's a niche scenario where you want to be in it. Now, for tanks, like I'm saying, this unwind, the second hit will be instant if you're in the fast zone, or will be delayed if you're in the slow zone here. So I believe this might actually rotate into me. Yeah, so that's what the instant one looks like. You can see the fast zone rotated into me at the last second, and I almost get one shot by this frontal. So something to keep in mind. So I'll fast forward to show the next one that's coming up here. I'll be in the slow zone for this one. You can actually see the time difference between these hits. So the boom, and you can see there the frontal does follow me there, and now you see another echo of the frontal, and this one is significantly slower, right? It's still going out, so I can still actually avoid this entirely because only the initial hit follows the tank. So something I'm not doing here is actually dodging the second hit. You can avoid this second hit, especially if you're in the slow zone, which halves your damage intake from this ability. So it happens about every 30 seconds for tanks. You will want to make sure that you are having some coverage for it every 30 seconds. But again, if you're in the slow zone, you don't need as much because you can step out of the second hit, assuming you go fast enough. You have a decent amount of time here, right? I definitely could have avoided it, but I just didn't. And because it's a frontal, of course, generally your group will want to play on the opposite side of your tank just to avoid them getting hit. Or you can see there, I believe the Warlock just kind of sidestepped out of the way, and I was stationary for that hit, right? He waited a little bit. Then he came in after that frontal was gone. So keep in mind there's a now big frontal on this boss. Outside of that, fragments, pretty easy for melee to dodge. You basically just want to rotate around counterclockwise. You can see here I can hide in behind these orbs in the slow zone. Pretty easy. For cast, you can see here he's hanging out in the slow zone, and then that makes it much easier for him to dodge some of the actual orbs. Probably find a better angle somewhere as well. Maybe here. For the idea spot, yeah, see they're in the slow zone, they're able to hide behind them, and they can step back like this right there, and that helps you step around these without moving too much as a ranged player. The other thing are these magic debuffs that go out 2 players at a time, and basically how this works is it shoots out a ring that deals damage to the entire party when they're dispelled or expired, and this ring is really slow if it gets dispelled in the slow zone, so it ticks a lot on players as it goes slowly through them, or super fast, doing 1 tick if you dispelled it in the fast zone. So this is the scenario where you want someone to go in the fast zone. Immediately, usually the squishiest player runs to the fast zone, gets dispelled. You want to stand still before you get dispelled, otherwise you eat your own circle tick. So keep that in mind. Get into the fast zone, stand still, dispel them, and then the second player will just go into the fast zone whenever their debuff's close to expiring, and again, stand still before it expires to avoid getting hit by their own ability. And that is basically this fight. The highest damage intake for the group is during those dispels. The highest damage intake for the tank is during the unwind frontal. So keep that in mind and use CDs accordingly. That is this guy, though. Let's move on to the Blight of Galakrond. Head here. Yeah, there we go. Switching specs again, as I recommend again. Switch specs whenever you can in here. Do whatever you need to do. This is a 3-phase fight. And so basically the phases are 100 to 80, 80 to 50, and then 50% to dead. And the big mechanic here are the corrosive infusion debuffs. So basically there's a random target dot that will mind control you after 12 seconds. And you can refresh the duration of this dot by touching another player, and that passes it to them instead of you, deals a hit of damage, and refreshes it to the full 12-second duration. You can completely avoid the application, though, as you see here, with a combat drop. So Vanish, Invis, or Shadow Meld. So our Priest Shadow Melds, boom, the dot doesn't even go out. So you can do that. It's very big value if you do it in the second or third phase, because there's longer durations between dot applications in each successive phase, but still not bad to use it whenever you can, just to reduce your damage intake. Now, in terms of how you actually get rid of this dot, you'll see it here, but basically whenever someone gets hit with the tank frontal, if they also have this corrosive infusion dot, it'll just disappear. So you're going to see here, goes out on someone. I'm going to go collect it as the tank player, and now I'm going to point the frontal away. And again, there's more time between the frontal cast and the actual corrosive infusion cast in each successive phase. So the timing in which you want to pass the debuff to the tank does change. So in phase 1, you can pass it just instantly to the tank, and that's fine, and that's what you need to do. Notice here, though, we transitioned to the second phase and the active corrosion debuff just disappeared. So you don't need to pass it if you're about to phase transition. It will just go away. Outside of that, swirlies spawn all the time throughout the fight. They will just stun you if you get hit, so make sure you avoid them. Phase 2 here, basically you want the initial person with the corrosion to hold it for almost the entire duration and then pass it to the tank. So again, we blocked it there. And the reason for that is, again, just the increased time. The new ability in this phase is the Necrotic Winds. So it's constant pulsing damage. It's also shooting out tornadoes, and it's also pushing players back a little bit as well. So you want to make sure you're avoiding these tornadoes. They will probably kill you if you get hit by them. And then during the second wave of tornadoes is when you'd actually switch. So we can show you on this next Corrosive Infusion going out. Boom, it goes out. And so now you're going to see us wait for near the end of this Corrosive Infusion. Here's the tornado starting. About the second wave of tornadoes. So second wave of tornadoes spawn, then we swap. So he's had only 3 seconds-ish left on his debuff. And now it'll be fine. I can hold it, and the boss will frontal. And I have plenty of time, so I'm not going to get mind controlled. Boom, eaten, debuff gone. So that's when you want to change it in P2. And then at 50%, you transition to B3. And you lose the tornado ability, so the tornado ability you never have to deal with again. And instead, each of these bosses gains an ultimate ability. The big thing is Dazak, this guy here, never is actually tanked. He doesn't move, he's stationary, and he'll just spam Noxious Ejection on random players. So nothing to do there. So tanks, you pick up Lozkaleth, and you just kind of drag him around to follow Dazak. Because basically, Dazak will jump to a random player and use Incinerating Blight Breath frontal through them, which you just need to avoid. But that means that you do bait the position of Dazak, which is important because of these puddles, which I haven't talked about yet, but basically, in every single phase, the bosses, as they move, just leave puddles behind them that grow. And so you want to slowly move so that your melee has room to stand, but you don't want to take up the whole room, right? Because these puddles will despawn, but this is from the beginning of the fight, right? This is from the very first phase. It's about to despawn, but it's still there, right? So you don't want to actually spread the entire room with these puddles. It's not good for sure. So I'm picking up Lozkaleth here, and you're going to see in about 10 seconds, the Blight Breath is going to get baited towards a random player here. And this is where you would want to position, again, away from puddles to kind of clear some space for your group. Let's see who it goes on. Boom. Yeah, I went on the melee DPS there, so it's not an ideal position. There's the frontal through the player as well. For this phase, in terms of the corruption debuff timing, you just want to keep it on the tank as much as possible, because there's, you see here, the debuff is out, and there's still 30+ seconds until the frontal. So you actually need to hold this debuff a lot. It does quite a bit of damage, so my recommendation is to basically hold it on your tank as much as possible, and then to just reset the duration, just have someone quickly pass it to. So for us, it's our rogue. He's going to come take the debuff from me. And I'm going to take it back after he takes it from me after this. Boom, boom. And then I'll just take it back relatively quickly and hold it, because it's better to have the damage on me as opposed to other random players. Now, the other ability you saw there was the Necrofrost going out. So this is just a random target ability that CCs a person, puts like a debuff on them. This debuff, though, can actually be cleared without killing it by using any form of non-stun CC or a movement-freeing effect. So if you had Freedom here, you could Freedom Tiger's Lust, you could Tiger's Lust, but you're going to see I drop a Fear Sigil on him, and this actually breaks the Necrofrost. Don't know why it works, but any fears work. I believe Disorients work as well, so like Incap Roar, that kind of thing. It's just stuns do not work on it for some reason. So weird thing, but you can kill them without actually having to damage them. So that is, I believe those are the 3 abilities in this phase, and then you're just kind of leaving as best as you can. The bosses share health, so the more you can keep them together, the more damage you can do to them, which is just a nice little bonus here to get through this phase a little bit quicker. And again, you can see here, we're passing the corrosion again. We're near when it's done, and Blight Reclamation is finally coming up, so I'm going to get this debuff, and I'll hold it until Blight Reclamation actually gets rid of it, and then you'll have to do that whole cycle again. But it's a pretty long cycle in the final phase. That is this guy, though. Let's move on to Iridikron. Iridikron is over here, I believe. There we go, a little bit too far. All right, so the sequence on Iridikron is basically starting with Extinction Blast. This goes on a random player. There's a big AoE. The only way to live is to step into the bubble that Chromie, she teleports away and makes a bubble near them. You'd have to step into it, but you're going to see here, I believe he's going to meld it off. Yeah, so you can, again, combat drop this ability. Melds, vanishes, those things like that. And then immediately after, the boss is going to start channeling Stonecracker Barrage. There's a big soak circle around Chromie and one smaller one in front. The tank wants to get in front and be in that circle, and everyone else wants to be in here to split damage with Chromie, because basically you wipe if Chromie dies here. So that's what you want to do. See it pop defensive because it deals, you know, decent damage if you're not ready for it. You may need the top players in between hits to make sure. And it does push back slightly, as you saw there. So tanks especially, don't get pushed out of your thing here. Make sure you're walking forward to stay inside your circle. And then as long as Chromie's alive, you'll get a little haste buff, which is nice. You can do some damage to the boss. And Chromie will be lower health now. You see here on the right side, there's Chromie health. And our healer is just topping Chromie because you want to make sure she's at full health for the next time that ability happens so that she can survive that one as well. From here, the boss is going to go into his intermission phase in Earth Surge. And this is actually where the new hard mode ability comes in, where the ticks from Earth Surge are going to apply a stacking vulnerability here, which increases the next Earth Surge tick by 25% per stack. So you want to get out of this shield phase pretty quickly. So you do actually want damage into this shield now. So we moved at 13 seconds. It wasn't too scary. As you can see, like this last tick, how much does that do? Where it is, every 6 seconds it ticks, by the way. So boom. So it wasn't too scary yet. We only had 3 stacks. You could probably go another like 10 to 15 seconds without, you know, getting one shot by them, but you don't want the shield phase to last much longer than 20 seconds, I would say. So try and make sure you have some sort of damage to actually help deal with that. On top of that, hard mode will now spawn ads under all 5 players. This was something we forgot on this poll. So we spec'd out of most of our CC to stop these mobs. So just don't forget that. There's a lot of mobs you need to group up. We're even relatively close together, so just be aware of that. It's a little dangerous. You just need to stop their cast basically and group them up. And now that they're grouped up, they're pretty easy to just AoE stop and cleave down. They don't really do much else besides those kicks, so just interrupts or AoE stops to prevent them. And then the boss kind of like repeats from here, and that's from the frontal. That's always every time the frontal goes out, the pulverizing exhalation, it puts these circles on every single player. Also, that for tanks, the debuff can actually get quite scary here. So it's the stacking debuff, which again is a stacking vulnerability on the tank for each like successive hit. So having things like parry and dodge are pretty good to let you reset stacks, because basically you have to parry or dodge an auto for this to stop stacking up. You can see here I'm going to 3, and then I parried 1, and then I reset my stacks again. So that's kind of how this works. So if this starts going up to 3, 4, you want to make sure you have like a pretty significant defensive active to actually survive that hit. Otherwise, the fight just kind of repeats here. When the boss hits 100 energy, which I believe is 90%-ish health, that's when you get into that big like exit phase where you get into this burn where you have to kill the boss before the boss kills you. Just for fast forwarding until that happens. So here it is. He'll run in the middle here. This big bubble comes up. You want to get in this bubble for like a big, like I think it's like cooldown reduction or something like that, haste, resource generation, just a massive buff by being in this bubble. And make sure you have damage to basically kill the shield here, which is basically draining his energy to 0 before he finishes this 30-second cast. So you do want to make sure that once you start getting towards 100 energy, that you do save some damage to make sure that you have the damage to actually beat this phase. So for us, for example, week 1, we were able to beat it with about 9-10 seconds left, so not too bad. It's not like a super tight check, but potentially you want to, like, we did drums it as well, right? So you may want to save something like Lust for that, just to help you get through it on the first try. And moving on, let's talk Tyr. All right, so Tyr, basically, he's got an energy bar, and his abilities, I believe, take 20 energy from that bar, and he'll do kind of a sequence of 4 different abilities in each phase to drain his energy. So every phase will start with Spark of Tyr going out. This is another duo magic debuff that goes out. You see a little AoE around players as well, and basically you want a similar idea. You want to dispel one pretty quickly, and then you can dispel the other one later. Basically, you dispel it. It deals damage to the entire party. It also deals damage around them, so don't want to be in that circle. And so by staggering it, you can let your healer actually get players topped a little bit to see how big that hit is there before anything dangerous happens. Particularly this Dividing Strike. And this is actually where we have something bad happen. We had this spell go off just before the Dividing Strike went out, and now we have players low, and I believe someone gets murdered here by that. Yeah, and we almost lose 2 people there to that. So it's something to keep in mind. You don't want to probably get rid of them just before a Dividing Strike happens, because that is something that where it splits the damage between all players. But alternatively, you can also kind of game these Dividing Strikes. You need to have at least 2 people in them, otherwise the boss enrages, I believe. But you can, if you have immunities in your group, just put an immune player in with your tank, and the tank just pops a defensive, and they should be able to survive that. That's what we end up doing on these later soaks, which I can fast forward to. I think just real quick to show you guys. Yeah, here. So basically, I think from here, I think our rogue is going to use Cloak as an example, and then basically just drastically reduces the party damage and siphons all the damage into tank damage. And you can see with the defensive meta up, it wasn't really too scary for me, and that's true for most tanks. If you have some sort of defensive up, you're not going to be too scared of it. Now, let's look at some of the other abilities in this phase, though. So there's the... Back up a little bit of this first phase. There's Dividing Strike. The other two abilities are either Titanic Blow or Infinite Annihilation. So here's Titanic Blow. This is on the tank, and this is a line attack on the tank that also knocks back the tank. So you want to make sure no one is in this line. Boom, there it goes. And also you don't get knocked off the edge. I targeted the wall here, so I don't get knocked off. Obviously, Demon Hunter, I could also have canceled it with Glide. You can cancel it with Leaps, that kind of thing as well. So keep that in mind, just don't get knocked off the edge. Then there's Infinite Annihilation, which targets a random player and does a frontal. And as you can see here, all the abilities here, besides the dispels, also leave behind this little yellow puddle as area denial. Similar to the first boss, these do eventually despawn, but they last for a decent chunk of time. So you want to try and be not terrible with your space. And then from there, when he hits 0 energy, he will begin to channel into the Oathstone in the center here. As you can see, I drag him a little closer to the center so that melee can get uptime, while also soaking some of these orbs here. So we have to do a bit more spread out because we accidentally murdered our friend with no battle res, which is not ideal. And so the goal here is to soak all these orbs before they touch the pillar, and that is because these orbs will do a detonation and give a bigger shield to the boss if they do touch this pillar. And at the same time, you will get a stacking haste buff here, pretty substantial haste buff, capped at 5 for soaking these orbs. So it's very, very good to soak these orbs. Both decreases the boss health, decreases your party damage, and gives you a damage buff. So make sure you're spreading out, getting all those orbs, and then moving back to the edge to, again, help put this yellow puddle stuff, ideally not in the direct center of the room, so you can easily soak without having to step into these puddles. Because these puddles do actually tick quite hard. Do not recommend bathing in them or anything like that. And then it just kind of repeats from there. Again, we got the Infinite Annihilation into the Titanic Blow. And you can see here, once it knows the combo, your DBM or big wigs or little wigs or whatever it is will tell you what the repeated ability is, because there is going to be one ability that gets repeated. In this case, it's the Titanic Blow, but it can also be the Infinite Annihilation Frontal. So just keep an eye on which ability gets cast twice. It's always going to be one of those two abilities. It'll never be the Dispel, and it'll never be the Soak. Those will only cast once per phase, but the Titanic Blow and the Infinite Annihilation, one of them is always cast twice per phase. So keep that in mind. You will have to do one of them twice. Otherwise here, just kind of repeating when you can at 0 energy. Try and pull the boss as close to the center as you can. I think I don't quite get the boss super close here. I could have used the Titanic Blow to actually shoot me towards the middle, and that would have made this a little bit easier. I get him decently close, but not quite enough. But also, it's not a huge deal. I'm just off the boss a little bit here to try and get some of these soaks since we're down a person again. But that is Tyr. Let's move forward and find Morchie. That should be around here, maybe. Yeah, just around here. All right, so Morchie. Big thing for tanks is the Sandblast is the frontal line attack. You can see the animation behind it goes straight through. Don't shoot it towards your friends. Other thing, don't pop your CDs on pull, because more problems will make the boss disappear like 10 seconds into this pull, 12 seconds into this pull. So not ideal to blow your CDs if you don't get to use half of them. Basically what this is a bunch of fake Morchies go around the room, and then there's one real Morchie, and you know which one is real because it's the one without a weird hat. So you got like pumpkins and giant cowboy hats, whatever, and there's this one here without a hat. So that is the real Morchie. You want to get either behind or to the sides, because he's going to do a big frontal here in a second. This is how big it covers. So if you'd actually be safe on the sides along here, so keep that in mind. If you're ever unsure, just get to the sides as quick as you can. But otherwise, you are likely dead if you're in this frontal. So you need to get behind or to the side of the real Morchie, and you have 8 seconds to do so. Otherwise, there's time traps that are going to get spawned here in a second. They spawn randomly throughout the room, and they will root you for 30 seconds. So that's a magic root, so you can dispel it. And also apply a dot when they ever explode to the entire raid that's stacked, so be aware of them. But you can use them for the familiar faces. So initially, these familiar faces, the very first cast of it, which happens here at around 45 seconds, is going to spawn a copy of each party member that will fixate them on their current location. See those portals spawn? It spawns party members, and they're going to become active in just a second here. And we're going to drop a sigil and CC them. And basically, these mobs will just fixate on their specific party member, and their auto attacks hurt. You do not want to get hit by them, which means that you don't really want to cleave down, because look at their 50 million HP. You don't want to spend 50 million HP into killing these mobs. And so instead, the best way to deal with them is to either hard CC them like we did here with sigils or like roots or like blinds, anything like that, or to kite them through these traps, and that will detonate the trap. They'll get stuck there until the next cast of Familiar Faces, but they will apply the dot to the entire party, so keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that for additional casts of Familiar Faces, they will appear wherever they were CC'd. So, for example, if we chain the CC until the next Familiar Faces, they would all appear here. But if like we kited them and like one broke in this circle, one broke here, one broke here, they would respawn on the next Familiar Faces by the circle that they cleared. Because of course, then one would be here, one would be here, one would be here, but these circles would be gone, right? Because when they touch them, they are consumed, essentially. If you have CC here, it can be pretty safe to just chain CC them because you also take no damage from the puddles. But if you don't have the CC, it's not a huge deal. You can just kite them. Just be aware you might need to use defensives and healing CDs to get you through the dot that the time traps apply. From there, it's just kind of repeating, right? So you're gonna, get the, familiar. You're gonna find the fake Morchie again. There she is across the room at blue. So we run across. And at the same time, these guys are going to start breaking their CC. And I don't quite hit the full sigil on them, so we're going to kite a few of them, I think, into the circle. And we're going to chain a CC out of this at the same time, right? Pointing the sandblast out and that kind of thing. And just rinsing and repeating here, using fears and stuff like that to try and get these guys into the other traps. That kind of thing. And just doing your best not to get autoed. Because you can see how much damage here, I think, auto there. Like, that's how much damage one auto does. So be very, very careful. And you can see there's the next cast of it, and they just kind of respawn wherever they were at that moment. We get the CC out on them, and then we just continue from there. So that is Morchie. Let's move on to the Time Lost Battlefield, which is a fight that does kind of differ depending on your faction when you zone in. So for Alliance, if you're the Alliance is the first person to zone in, then you'll get the Horde fight, which is Grommash here. If you're a Horde player, is the first one to zone in, you'll get like an Anduin Lothar fight or something like that. I don't quite remember, but it's an Alliance version skin. Then they're basically the same, different like ability mob names and actual names of the abilities, but they do the same thing. There is one slight advantage to fighting the Grommash version of the fight, which I'll get into later on. But if you can, have an Alliance member zone in first, so you get this fight specifically. Now, throughout this fight, the boss has a bunch of abilities that can hit not only players, but also these like friendly NPCs that are kind of around the room. And anytime he kills anyone, a player or a friendly NPC, he gains a stack of a damage amp. I believe it's called Battle Hardened or Battle Sense, something like that. And basically on his auto attacks, it causes them to do nature damage to the party. So you want to make sure you're positioning like this here on the edge of the room, such that these shock waves get baited away from all of the friendlies in the middle of the room. And also this blade storm that's coming up can get kited along the edge of the room here, again, away from the friendlies, because those are the two main culprits. If you shockwave through the middle of the room, like everyone up here is going to get hit, and maybe the boss gets like 6-7 stacks of that damage attack on his auto. So it's not ideal for sure. So you want to tank towards the edge here. This is like the diamond, you kind of to give you reference, and everyone else on the outside. In terms of shockwave itself, know that the first tick of shockwave is always on the tank. You can see, boom, it's always on me. And then it's going to alternate on some other random player there. And then go back again. I don't remember if the third tick is on the tank again or if it's on a random player after that. But for sure, the first hit is always on the tank, so keep that in mind. The other thing to be aware of in this fight are the ad spawn. So for the Horde here is going to cast, for the Alliance, if it's the other fight, boom, you get 3 ads. It prioritizes giving 1 of each ad type because there are 3 ad types here, and I believe we got 1 here. If you've killed all of 1 ad type in the field, then it will give you 2 of another ad type, so keep that in mind. Warlocks, you just want to keep them kicked here. They have a tank targeted cast and an AoE cast. Horde grunts don't really do anything. Tanks just pick them up. Axe throwers are the priority. These are also archers if you're in the Alliance version of the fight. These guys have a bleed that goes on a random player, and that is pretty dangerous when combined with some of the other party damage going out here. That's serrated axe on this guy or some other arrow attack for the other guy. And the key is, which you can see early on the spawn here, is that for some reason the Horde axe throwers, they will get interrupted if you're just attacking them. So you're going to see this first serrated axe gets interrupted before it even casts because we attacked the mob. So pets attacking them will do it, melee attacking them will do it, anything really will do it. Just attacking them for some reason interrupts their dangerous bleed. Otherwise, you'll need to use like a stun on them initially to prevent that bleed from going off. So that's the advantage of having the Horde version of this fight. For some reason that works, but otherwise, it's not a huge deal. You just need to make sure that you CC that axe thrower and focus them down first, or the archer rather, in the Alliance version of the fight. Tank hits decapitate. It's 2 hits back to back that are pretty substantial and also apply a 75% healing reduction. So if you have like an absorb shield or something like that, make sure you apply it just before the hit goes out, so it's not actually reduced by the healing absorb. Otherwise, you always want to make sure you have some sort of coverage for that hit, because it is a quite a strong hit. And then also on top of that, the only other ability will just occasionally he'll do like an AoE on the party. He'll like yell. There's like no cast time on it, just does like a big yell, and will do some damage to the party, which isn't too dangerous, especially if you keep the boss's stacks relatively low. And then of course Blade Storm just targets a random player and follows them, so you just kite it around this outer edge, and then whenever you can, just recenter the boss after that. So that is the second last boss of the instance. Let's move on now to the final boss, Chrono-Lord Deios here. And so for this boss fight was definitely the hardest hitting boss fight for a tank player. And that is from the combo of the breath ability and then the adds that spawn in phase 1. So this breath ability basically applies a 10-second dot to you that is pretty nasty. And at the same time, he'll summon 4 keepers throughout this first phase. And basically when you pick up these keepers, they spam infinite blast into your tank. So it's a lot of tank damage when you have a keeper out with Chrono-Lord Deios. And so you really want to make sure you have good coverage for whenever there is a tank frontal plus an infinite keeper out. So you see right now I have brands on both mobs, and I used Fell Dev as well to kind of sustain for this. When a keeper is up, everyone is hard focusing this keeper down to kill it as quickly as possible. It will also spawn some ads and also put a magic debuff on a random player. So dispel that debuff, and tanks can pick up the ads and just cleave them down. They aren't really a priority. The priority is certainly the keeper itself, and then you can move to the boss after the keeper is dead. Now, the other big thing on this boss fight throughout the fight is going to be these infinity orbs. This spawn under 2 random players. It prioritizes ranged players. So for us in our group, we only have 2 ranged players. We have a priest and a warlock, and our healer is a monk, so he doesn't count as ranged. So you're going to see every single spawn of these infinity orbs are going to be on the priest and the warlock, no matter where they are, because that's just who it prioritizes. It's ranged. So here it goes, boom, mage and the warlock out there. And so we've just assigned one of our players to always stay in and one to always go out. So for us, it's the warlock will always just plant in his orb, and the priest will always get out of it. And the reason for that is when the orbs hit the ground, they do an explosion, and that does party damage, but also they apply this little 4-second vulnerability to your group here, which increases the damage taken by that orb explosion. So you want to make sure that one of them drops really quickly, and they drop quicker if there's no one under them, and then one of them drops slower, and they drop really slow if someone stays inside the circle. So that's why you always want one player basically assigned to stay inside a circle, and then the other player will get out. Again, this can get a little bit weird if you have more than 2 ranged players, or even less than 2 ranged players. I guess it's not a big deal. If you have 1 ranged player, just say the melee person always gets out and the ranged player always stays in, or whatever it is. But yeah, if you have like 3 ranged players, for example, if our healer was like any other healer that's not monk or paladin, it would pick 2 of the 3 of them to spawn underneath. So then you might need to say, hey, if our warlock is always going to be in, he needs to run into a circle if one of the circles doesn't spawn on him, for example, right? So something to keep in mind. It could be it gets a little weird as you get to higher number of ranged players, but generally just having one person assigned is the way to go. So basically now there is a bit of a rotation in terms of how the mobs will spawn. They will spawn based on where you tank the boss. And so I like to tank the boss initially right over here on this little rock. That's where the very first spawn will happen. So you can see here right beside this little rock that I was pointing out. That's where the first keeper spawns, and he stands right here. So it's very, very nice. And then the next keeper will spawn right here, and he'll run over to this left side. And then the last set of keepers will spawn over here and run across the room. So this is how I like to tank the boss. There's no right or wrong way to do this. So there's plenty of other spots you can tank the boss and have like a similar outcome. This is just the movement we were used to through doing this dungeon in Season 3. So you're going to see here, he spawns another keeper. And again, we're going to hit this keeper, immediately swap to it as we're moving to the next portal spot over here by this rock. And again, I'm facing this frontal away from the group here. This is another big damage overlap with the frontal and the keeper alive. So again, we're hard focusing this keeper. And then you're going to see the last set of keepers, which is 2 keepers at a time, spawn here just after this, followed by the temporal breath. Something you can do, especially for this last temporal breath, is you can actually outrange it. You need to be careful though, because you kind of need to point the frontal like this way to actually be able to outrange it. It's similar to the Laymore tip I talked about in my most recent hard boss video, where you can actually like use like double leap as a demon hunter and actually outrange it, or like heroic leap and just running with speed, or any like big movement like that, essentially to actually fully outrange this temporal breath. It is possible, and you can actually see the definitive edge of the breath here. So it's not too far actually. So something to keep in mind. You can do that, especially on that last breath. Just be careful not to cleave your friends. For here, we just make sure tanks pick up both keepers because they will just spam cast in your DPS if you don't pick one of them up. And we are hard focusing one of them just to get rid of the double keeper, because when it's just a single keeper, it's not too scary for the tank. Much less scary than having the boss in a keeper or by having two keepers, right? So move over to this final keeper, get everything established, and we'll kill it at the end. Note, range can actually be multi-dotting the boss during this time as well. He's just flying around in the air. And you still have orbs to deal with at the same time. So again, the Warlock is kind of staying in. And now we're going to deal with the Infinite Corruption mechanic in P2. So basically, it's going to spawn swirlies underneath every single player. All these swirlies boom, and these leave puddles on the ground as well. So you want to make good use of your space, not try and, run maniacally like a, crazy man all across the entire middle of the room. You want to just try and make sure you keep them relatively clustered here. The Tank Buster is much less scary in this phase because it's just the frontal. There's no extra man hitting you with bolt spam, so not a big deal there. And then the next Infinite Corruption is going to happen again. We're just filling in as little room as we can, just kind of in this area, and we'll just use as much room as or as little room as possible rather, so that by the time we get back around to this area, these puddles have begun to despawn. In terms of defensive usage, the best time to use it is for these Infinite Corruptions. You tend to want to have some sort of coverage, whether that's personal or a group defensive, because you can see here we have an orb going out, and you're always going to get this orb detonation, this second orb detonation during this Infinite Corruption ticking damage. So that's what the biggest damage hit of this fight is, the orb exploding at the same time as the Infinite Corruption going out. So keep that in mind. Watch your health. Use a health pot, health stone, whatever, defensive as needed. And that is kind of this fight here. You're conserving as much space as possible, and technically that allows you to fight this boss indefinitely, right? The only other thing is there's some dragon buffs that you get at the top here, and the dragons will actually jump down and fight. So you get like 2 buffs throughout the first phase, and then you'll get the other 2 buffs in this last phase, and they all like jump down and start doing damage to the boss. As you can see here, I think at sub 8%-ish is when they all jump down, and they actually help kill the boss a fair bit as well. So technically, I think if you push the boss below 8%, I believe your tank could technically solo it with the help of the dragon damage. So something to keep in mind if you do start to lose people here. But there we have it, guys. That is my walkthrough guide for Dawn of the Infinite's hard mode. Hopefully this helped you guys out, and if it did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more in-depth dungeon guides, both in Season 4 and beyond into the War Within. As always, I have to give a massive thank you to my amazing Patreon supporters for making videos like this possible, and I'll see everyone in the next video.